Even though the lights were dimmed, Times Square was mobbed most every night during World War II. Something like 3 million servicemen from all the Allied nations surged through it. Around them swirled New Yorkers who wanted to drink with them, dance with them, sleep with them, and or pick their pockets. In May 1944, New Yorker columnist and art critic Robert M. Coates, who a few years later would offhandedly coin the term abstract expressionism, wrote a long downbeat description of Times Square on a Saturday night. Everywhere around him were small knots of soldiers and sailors who, he wrote, wanted to have a good time, but they were painfully uncertain how to go about it. Moving among them were small groups of young women and teenage girls. And I was surprised to see how casually pickups were made, he wrote. For the most part, a fellow would simply pull up alongside a girl and glance at her. If she smiled, he took her arm. If she didn't, he just walked on. Military brass, health officials, law enforcement, and society's moral watchdogs all worried about these women and girls who flocked around men in uniform wherever they were. They called them victory girls, khaki-wackies, even patriotutes. By the time of Coates's article, New York City courts were reporting large increases in arrests for prostitution, other offenses against common decency, and female juvenile delinquency. There was also a noticeable increase in births out of wedlock. The military was particularly concerned that both professional prostitutes and amateur patriotutes were spreading venereal diseases that could seriously weaken the nation's capacity to fight. It was argued a diseased prostitute can do far more damage than a 500-pound bomb dropped squarely in the middle of an army camp. Syphilis was still a great scourge at the start of the war. Treatments were drawn out and not guaranteed effective. The country would be 3 years into the war before limited supplies of the new miracle cure, penicillin, were available. Military brass conceded that if you segregated hordes of healthy young males on army bases and ships for long periods of time, when you let them loose, they were going to race off to do what young men do. You couldn't punish them for that without seriously damaging morale. They also worried that if you denied them female company, they'd turn to homosexuality, described as a blight known to ravage European armies. So they showed them instructional films on the horrors of VD and posted the walls of bases with similar messages. Because the young men in uniform apparently couldn't be restrained, the authorities then focused on the females. Former gangbuster Elliot Ness, who ran a federal agency called the Social Protection Division, gave serious thought to rounding up women and girls accused of prostitution or promiscuity and quarantining them in camps for the duration of the war. New York City considered a midnight curfew for girls, but not boys, 16 and younger. Newspapers and magazines fretted endlessly about these wanton and potentially diseased females. There were even a couple of Broadway plays addressing what seemed to be a grave threat to, as J. Edgar Hoover put it, America's moral fibers. Coates would evoke the spring of 1944 later in a slim, melancholic 1946 novel, The Bitter Season. He writes there that the vast dislocations of the war had produced a sort of global loneliness that drove people into places like Times Square and its overstuffed bars, instinctively seeking some kind of human contact and life in a world given over to death.